Okay, tonight what I'm planning to do is basically talk about different risks that you can be exposed when you are doing business internationally. So there are in general three exchange rate risks exposures if you're doing business internationally. One is called transaction exposure, another one is called translation, and another one is called economic or operational exposure, and I will talk about that. So, what do you think? Some of you are business people, so you have business experience. When you are doing business internationally, what is going to change more significantly? Interest rates in different parts of the world or interest rates in different parts of the world? How much can interest rate change in one day, for example? What do you think? How much interest rate in Russia can change in one day? Quarter percent, for example. Okay. And that's really not every single day. How much can exchange rate change in one day? You remember when I was talking about crisis in Southeast Asia, it actually can drop 50% overnight. So that is giving you an idea why studying exchange rate movements is very important. And that's why I put tonight's presentation with the title, How the Exchange Rate Can Really Destroy Your Business. That's why it's very, very important to understand that, because volatility of exchange rate is much more significant than volatility of, let's say, interest rates. And in this particular slide, you can see this is in one day how much the currency euro versus US dollar was changing. So this was in the 7 o'clock in the morning. This is where it was, let's say, in 2002. You see it was here. Then by 10, 11 o'clock in the evening, it increased this much. And then by the beginning of the following day, it actually dropped here. So you can see if any of your obligations or any of your, depending which country, in which currency you are either receiving or have to having payables, it can go from here to here. It is definitely going to have a very significant impact on your profit, a very significant impact on your company. And in this particular case, as you can see here, I put here, this is the interest rate volatility in Australia, but this is how their dollar was fluctuating. As you can see here, in particular, from this time frame, let's say 1997 or up to 2019, there was almost no significant changes in interest rate. But you see how much more volatile the exchange rate is. And again, another illustration why it is very important to study exchange rate movements and why companies need to think about it and think how they're going to protect themselves against this really, really very volatile item. And here are some possible examples. For example, direct economic exposure. So if we are having sales abroad, if we are exporting something, and then if home currency increased in its value, it is actually unfavorable for us. Why? Because the revenue is worth less in home currency terms. However, if the home currency weakens, then we will be actually able to exchange much more of our earned money into our currency. And as you can see in each of those, the effect on your profit is going to be different. Since I will be posting this, you will then actually be able to go through each of those scenarios on your own, and I will be testing you how did you understand this on Friday as well. This is an indirect economic exposure also, and then what are the consequences if the currency, home currency, is increasing in its value or decreasing in its value. Now, we very often talk about long run and short term. Obviously, in the long run, companies can adjust, can change something in the way that they're either trading with this particular country, or if they have foreign direct investment in another country, they may actually be able to adjust either their receivables and payables in those different currencies. But in the short term, there is really not that much that they can do in order to avoid exchange rate exposure. So in the short term, no matter what is happening, no matter what the company is, they will be exposed to this exchange rate exposure, and therefore they will have again to think about it, what we do this. On this particular slide, you have three different perceptions and perspectives. Perspectives of investor hedge argument. Should we basically hedge or not hedge? The other one is currency diversification argument. Well, maybe if I have diversified receivables and payables, then maybe I wouldn't be exposed to this exchange rate movements. We'll see if that holds or not. And then we have stakeholder diversification. Basically what they're saying, stakeholders are well diversified. If they're well diversified, they will be somehow isolated against losses due to multinational exchange rate risk. And for good or for bad, this is really not the case, because even if you are diversified, you will be, depending on the situation, exposed to exchange rate risks. And those are some quotes from the very reputable companies. And as you can see in both of these cases, they're recognizing the seriousness of exchange rate exposure. And in the case of Procter & Gamble, they said, because we manufacture and sell products in a number of countries throughout the world, we are exposed to the impact on revenues and expenses of movements in currency exchange rates. And PepsiCo, increased volatility in foreign exchange rates may have an adverse impact on our business results and financial conditions. And if you are, for example, for any reasons doing in any of future classes analysis of annual reports of the companies that are publicly traded, they have to have their annual reports. You will see that in those annual reports, they will actually report what are they doing with exchange rate movements? Are they hedging or not hedging? And how they are hedging, if they are hedging. And again, so those are those three forms of exchange rate exposure: transaction, translation, and economic. Transaction exposure. As the word says, if we are importing or exporting something, for example, we obviously have a transaction. I'm selling, for example, I'm selling, what am I selling? Laptops. And you are buying those laptops. There is a transaction. There is a laptop that needs to go from my hands to your hands. And therefore, I will be exposed, because my earnings from sales will be exposed to that exchange rate. But at the same time, you will have to be paying me, so you will also be exposed to this exchange rate movements, because your currency can depreciate or appreciate in this process, because payments usually don't happen on the moment we actually have done the transaction. Payments usually happen with some delay. Is it like 30 days? It's 60 days, 90 days, depends. So in that time frame, the currency can fluctuate a lot. And as I have shown in that first, actually one of the first slides, the fluctuation of the currency is much more significant than the fluctuation of interest rates, for example. So having said that, what we want to find out is how much we are exposed. And since we are multinational corporations, most likely we will be trading, importing or exporting, not only in one currency, but in multiple currencies. So what we have to do, we actually have to find out what is our net cash exposure, what is the in different currencies and as a total. And again, there is an example. For example, we have here British pound, Canadian dollar, Swedish krona, Mexican peso. This is our total inflow. This is how much money we'll be receiving in those currencies. This is our total outflow. This is how much we will be paying in this particular currency. And when you combine these two numbers and see what is what, you will see in this particular case that our net inflow-outflow, meaning like the difference between those two, here it's 10 million pounds Canadians is like 10 million Canadian. And as you can see, because we have total inflow of 12 million, however, we have to pay in Canadian dollars. So the difference is 10 million and so forth. Now, we have an expected rate, exchange rate at the end here. And then we can say, well, this is actually what we are expecting our net inflow to be. Now, what is wrong with this table? I just explained every single element here, but what is missing here? Or what can be done differently here? Will anybody be brave enough to start, to try? So again, I cannot change anything here. Total inflow and total outflow are given. Net inflow and outflow is given because it's derived from this one. But is there anything that you see that it may be actually not accurate? So again, we are projecting, our net inflow or outflow.
So maybe this table doesn't account for different exchange rates for inflows and outflows. If your inflows and outflows occurred in the different periods of time.
Very good. So there are actually two things now, since you mentioned that. One thing is that in order for all of this to work, that will mean that we will have at the same time payables and receivables in the same currency. And anybody who has done any type of international trade that knows that is most likely not going to happen at the same day I have to pay and at the same day I'm receiving in that foreign currency. So on having said that, this one is actually saying here expected exchange rate. But since this is a forecast, this actually can be 1.5, but it can also be 1.4, or it can also be 2. So then this whole thing needs to be adjusted, this whole table. And in this particular case, now we are actually, this is more likely to happen. We were including the range that that exchange rate can move from the lowest to the highest. This is more likely because that will give us better perception. What if exchange rate dropped to this level and what if it increased at this level? And as you can see here, now those numbers that we will be exposed to transaction exchange rate are much, much more significant. The gap between this one and this one, this one and this one is much more significant because of those different possible scenarios. Exposure, and again, what we have to do, obviously, we have to find out how much are those exchange rates between two currencies fluctuating during the certain period of time. So what is their standard deviation? Also, what we have to find out is what is their, let me just show you that one, what that means. Okay. Okay, as you can see here, we have the Australian dollar. It can fluctuate everywhere from 0 to, let's say, 7%. So that's their standard deviation. They can go from this number to this number. Look at the Hungarian forint at a time. That one can actually, 2012, can fluctuate up to 9%. That's a huge fluctuation, you know, and it's going to be obviously impacting your receivables and payables. What we then also have to look is the currency volatility over time. So what does that mean? That means that this lighter blue is actually standard deviation between 2005 and 2007. These darker colors is actually how much are they fluctuating from 2008 to 2010. And as you can see here, for example, for Mexican peso, in this first time frame, they were really not that much fluctuating. They were fluctuating maybe like 2%. However, in the next time frame, they were actually fluctuating much more significantly, like 9%. So we take into consideration that as well. And what we also want to look is about correlation of currencies. What does that mean? That means that if, let's say, Hungarian currency goes up, is Australian dollar going up? So they're correlated, they're both going up. Or is the Australian dollar going down when Hungarian currency is going up? And this is what that correlation is about. If you look euro is correlated mostly with which currency? British pound or Canadian dollar? Where is the higher correlation? The higher the number, the more correlated they are. So where are they more correlated? With British pound or with the Canadian dollar? With the British pound. Okay, what about Swedish krona? Which country's Swedish or currency Swedish krona is correlated more with? With euro. Why do you think that they're more correlated with euro than with other currencies?
Because, as you said, the number is bigger. That means that the correlation is more significant. Why? Because Sweden is nearby European Union, and they have a lot of trade connections. And that's why they correlate much more than with Japanese yen, for example.
Excellent point, definitely, because they are trading with each other much more, and that's why their currency is much more correlated with euro than with the Canadian dollar, for example. And then what we have here is what we now want to look into, applying currency correlation to net cash flow. So now we are going to look all those different correlations between different currencies. Are they going in the same direction, in the opposite direction? How much are they correlated, closer or not that closer? And what is actually happening over time? And all of that, when we put into thing, you can get table, something like that. If we have multinational corporations expected cash flow situation, the following. Equal amounts of net inflow in two currencies. So we are expecting net inflows in two currencies to be the same. And the currencies are highly correlated. The multinational corporation exposure is relatively high. Why it is relatively high? What does that mean? We have net inflow in those two currencies that are highly correlated. And why do you think that then we came up with this, that exposure is relatively high? When will that exposure be lower? And how that exposure can be lower? You know, if we have the, okay, you want to try?
But you may see it on the table, like if, for example, the situation is the same, but the currencies are negatively correlated, you have low. I don't know.
Okay, what is happening here? We have net inflow obligations in those two currencies, and they're highly correlated. That means if If one goes up, the other is going to go up. So that means that there is nothing that I can, by diversifying, having maybe this currency that goes up, but then having also the other currency that goes down, so I can actually level that rate exposure. So that's why this is much more open. As you can see here, for example, that's what I just explained. Equal amount of then influence the two currencies, but they are negatively correlated. So one currency is going to appreciate, another one is going to depreciate. I have the same net inflow. That means that, at the end, both of them, whatever I will be exposed in this one and losing maybe, I will be gaining with this one because that one is going to go in an opposite direction. Transaction exposure can be measured based on the value at risk. So basically what we want to find out here is how much on a daily basis we are exposed. What does that mean? How much on a daily basis we are exposed? What we have to figure it out is what is our expected percentage change in the currency. And again, when I say expected, that means that you are projecting, you are forecasting. There is not 100% certainty that your forecast is going to be correct. Then you have confidence level. That means how confident am I that my projection is going to be correct. And then finally, you have to have a standard deviation based on these daily percentages changes. And then you're going to calculate all of this. But again, everything is projection. So even I want to get a general picture, how much I will be exposed, how much I will be at risk, how much that currency that I am exposed either in receivables or payables is going to change. And when you do all of that, there is one additional thing. If I do that in one currency, that's not enough because I have receivables and payables and a big multinational corporations in many different currencies. So again, I will have to calculate portfolio of all of that. So all of this I'm just telling you and trying to explain is to bring to your attention the complexity of trying to figure it out. How much we are at risk if we have receivables and payables in multiple different currencies. There may or may not be correlated, or they may be negatively correlated, and definitely it brings, all seriousness of this particular thing. And again, this is just the process. What do you need to do in order to calculate that value at risk? And once you do all of those calculations and you go to the last line, what you see here, standard deviation for Swiss franc is actually 5.57. That means how much it can fluctuate. Standard deviation for Argentine peso is 4.58. But because I have exposure in both currencies, I actually have to calculate the percentage change in equal weighted portfolios. And as you can see, this one is much smaller than actually in this one in Swiss franc or Argentine pesos. And again, those are just limitations of this value at risk because obviously you have what will happen if we don't have so-called exchange rate movements are not normal, or exchange rate movements is not stable over time, and it's all of those certain things that are bringing additional, level of uncertainty. Is this really number that I came up with? Is this really number that they came up with really the real number that I will be at risk with my receivables and payables? Now, economic exposure. Economic exposure, to present that concept in the simplest form, will include that everything that is going to be affected by appreciation or depreciation of the currency, and that it is linked to operations in that particular currency, can be defined as economic exposure. Now, I have a question for you. What do you think? Can we avoid this exchange rate exposure if we will price our products or services in our currency? For example, if we are Russia and we are exporting something to United States, and when we are exporting that product, we are quoting and we are demanding our partners in the United States to pay us in rubles, not in dollars. Do you think that we will be risk-free from exchange rate exposure?
I suppose no, because there are some factors which we cannot influence on. For example, this drones attack on Saudi Aramco company, which lead to increase of oil price and then to increase of ruble dollar, so to say, relations. And I guess in this case, if we get payment in rubles, we may lose some money because now ruble power is much more than it was before, and like we get less benefit than we could.
Anybody else? So again, we will be now invoicing our export products or services in our currency, our country's currency, that I have all obligations toward my workers, I have to pay them in local currency. I have obligations toward my suppliers, I also have to pay them in my local currency. So will I be avoiding exchange rate if I invoice my services or my products in my own currency?
I think that's yes, maybe partly. Of course, we cannot know some things which can involve influence on our own currency. But at the same time, we have a case with the Germany in the European Union, which for Germany it's more beneficial to have one currency, and they in some sort don't have this exchange risk.
From one hand, yes, but from other hand, we can get some problems in case our own currency rate of our own currency will increase. The price of our product also increase for our buyers from other states.
Okay, anybody else would like to try? Anything else? Okay.
I would say that if the company is sure that their currency is strong, so it may actually be better for them to pay their partners in their currency. But it can also affect their partners because they are not really into paying in, for example, euro, because it's better for them, usually for the local companies, to pay in their own currency. But sometimes, for example, international law firms paying their workers in US dollars. So they ensuring their workers that if something happened, for example, in Russia, it will not affect their salary.
Well, they're all good answers here, and I think that we have one consensus, almost consensus, that actually by invoicing our export in our local currency, we will still be exposed to the exchange rate risk. Because, okay, we can think, I gave them this price, and they know how much that cost, and they translate that in all their currency. But what will happen if their economy goes in recession? If the economy goes into recession, that means that they will not be able to repay us in any currency. And then, despite the fact that we are thinking we are protecting ourselves from the exchange rate exposure, we are actually not protecting ourselves because of all those circumstances that can be happening on that export market, that they can actually influence now how much of that payables we will be receiving altogether. So we have to look not only the currency that we are receiving, but we also have to look into economic situation in any particular country. And with this one, again, the sensitivity of the firm's cash flows to exchange rate movement, sometimes referred as the operating exposure. This one, let's start with this particular firm. It's like US firm, has a contract to export products in which it agreed to accept euros. Now, what if euro depreciates? So we are exporting something, we are a United States company, we are exporting something in euros, but what if that euro depreciates? What will be the impact of my receivables as an American company? How much dollars will I receive? Less, obviously, because now their currency is valued less. So for the same 1,000 of euro, I will be getting much less dollars than before depreciation. And then, let's say, export products, so again, US firm, exports products to the United Kingdom that are priced in dollars, and competitors are located in the United Kingdom. What is going to happen? If we have pound depreciation, causing some customers to switch to the competitors, because instead of being priced in dollars, because of this depreciation, whatever we want to sell them is going to be much more expensive, and they're simply going to switch to other competitors from other countries that are already operating in British pounds. Economic exposure and exchange rate, we have all of those, again, different options. What if this goes down? What if this goes up? And how much is all of that going to influence our inflows and our transactions? This is also how we can measure economic exposure. Again, the whole point is we are not going to have economic exposure only in one currency. We are going to have, as a multinational corporation, our exposure in multiple currencies because we are trading and having our operations in multiple currencies around the world. Now, this is one possible scenario. So we have US business, Canadian business. We have sales, cost of material, operating expenses, interest expenses, cash flow. Now, when you look here, what we are trying to do here with calculating, with forecasting how much we are going to be exposed if we actually we are starting to introduce the three scenarios. First scenario says Canadian dollar is going to be equal 0.75 US. Canadian dollar in another one is going to be 0.80. And Canadian dollar here is actually going to be very, very good and expensive, and it's going to be 85. So now, what we want to find out with all those initial data that we had from the previous table, with all of those initial data, we're going to plug them here. And as you can see here, when we plug all of that, depending on do we have more sales in one currency or do we have more cost of materials, meaning do we have more receivables, do we have more payables? And based on those three different scenarios, we can be exposed. You know, exchange rate scenario is here 52. The last one is 31.9. So you can see here how much difference we can be exposed if that exchange rate moves from 0.75 to 0.85. Now, all of those like economic exposure and transaction exposure, they were all directly related with some kind of sales or some kind of import or some kind of operations in those different countries. So we have physical product, we have physical, in a certain way, real sales of services, sorry. We have physical operations, foreign direct investments and factories and all of that in the different country, foreign country. Now, when we talk about translation exposure, this is really, really different. Why it is different? In general, when we have multinational corporations and they're operating around the world, and let's suppose like it is a Russian multinational corporation that is operating in 5 different countries. At the end of the day, meaning at the end of the year, in which currency will that multinational corporation be presenting their operations? Were they successful? Were they making profit? Not making profit? Is it going to be in Russia rubles? Is it going to be in dollars? Is it going to be in something altogether different? Again, they're operating in 5 different countries. What is going to happen is that every country has their own, every company, multinational corporation, has obligations to report their earnings in their local currency. In this case, that will be Russian ruble. In the case of United States, multinational corporations from United States, they have to report at the end of the year whatever they have done in this year. Did we make profit or did we lose? They have to report that number in US dollars. What does that mean? That means that they can actually be quite successful making money in another country. But once that statement, accounting statement, is translated from that local currency to the US dollar, if that currency depreciated, they actually can be reporting negative results. So although there is nothing physical going wrong in their operations in that particular foreign market, because of the exchange rate movements, at the end of the day, they have to report in US dollars, and that's why we call this translation exposure, and they have to translate their balance into US dollars. And if the exchange rates move unfavorably, they are going to be affected. Now, there are different accounting standards and accounting practices that are different by different countries. But how you are going to translate? Are you going to translate at the current exchange rate? Are you going to translate at the weighted average exchange rate? Are you going to do some other translations that can always impact the final results? And at the end of the day, when you report your profit or loss, if because your profit and loss will be affected with this exchange rate differential, you can actually, that can directly impact the valuation of your corporation. So that's why companies always in those annual reports, they will have one asterisk and they will say in a footnote that this was due to translation exposure. So that the potential investors now are going to look at this annual report and they say, aha, it's not that they were really not performing well on that market. It's really that that currency dropped. And that's why the final result is the way it is. And this is just an example how this can happen. And I know that you are ready for one short video now. So let's see this one.
When a company does business internationally and buys or sells goods in a different country, it will either pay for purchases in the foreign currency or earn income from sales in the foreign currency. Exchange rate risk becomes a factor in these interactions because the value of the foreign currency could change between the time of the transaction and the time the payment is made or received and converted to the company's home currency. A lag of 30 to 90 days in accounts payable is fairly common, so global companies often have at least a 30-day window when fluctuations in exchange rates could result in paying or earning more or less than they planned on. Global firms seek to reduce or even eliminate this exchange rate risk by adopting one of three common strategies: spot rate exchanges, a hedge, or a currency swap. Let's take a look at each one of these strategies. Spot rate exchanges allow a firm to buy the needed foreign currency at the so-called spot rate at the time of the transaction. This eliminates the time gap between agreeing on a price and making the payment. For instance, if Hyundai Motors of Korea were to agree to buy rubber from Salim Ivamas Pratima, an Indonesian rubber company, Hyundai could simultaneously sign the contract and buy Indonesian rupiah to pay Salim even if the payment were not due for a few weeks. This way, Hyundai would remove the risk of the rupiah gaining value relative to the South Korean won in the intervening period. The next strategy used in managing foreign exchange risk is a hedge. Hyundai could hedge its foreign exchange risk by agreeing with a bank to buy an option that would allow it to purchase a set amount of rupiah at a set price in 30, 60, or 90 days. Agreeing to the price for the rupiah ahead of time allows Hyundai to transfer any exchange risk to the bank. This type of transaction is also called a forward contract. In essence, it takes the future exchange rate and shifts the risk to the bank for a fee. Another type of hedge, called an option contract, lets Hyundai purchase rupiah at an agreed-upon rate in the future, but Hyundai is not required to buy the foreign currency if the previous agreed-upon rate is worse than the rate the company can get on an open market. For instance, if the rupiah becomes less expensive in the period, Hyundai can use the current spot rate to purchase rupiah when its payment is due and pocket the difference. Hyundai pays the bank for the option whether it exercises it or not, but buying the option removes the company's downside risk. The third strategy global firms use to manage foreign exchange risk is a currency swap. With a currency swap, two global firms borrow money in their local currency and then swap the principal with the other party. For instance, if a British company needs Brazilian real and a Brazilian company needs a similar amount of British pounds, the British company could borrow pounds while the Brazilian company borrows real. Then the companies swap their currencies, giving each company the foreign currency it needs, but allowing each company to pay back the loan in its local currency, eliminating exchange rate risk. These three strategies help mitigate the risk of doing business internationally with foreign currency.
Okay, I mean, up to this point, I was explaining quite complicating and actually scary concepts, and trying to emphasize this exchange rate risk and how the companies can be negatively, but also positively affected with this. And then I show you this video. And the purpose of showing you this video is to give you an idea that companies do have possibilities to, in a certain way, insure themselves against exchange rate risks. What does that mean? Like any insurance that you are buying in order to not to make accidents and then think, okay, I'm going to make an accident and I know that my insurance company is going to pay for it. Most of the times people don't do that because of that and don't behave that way. I'm not saying that there are not certain people who will do it, but in general, you're buying insurance in a way that you want to protect yourself against the worst case scenario. And that is that if you have an accident, it will be paid by your insurance. So the same thing, the same logic is really applied here. Companies are definitely facing with these difficulties in dealing with exchange rates. And in order to try to hedge, to insure to themselves against those risks, they're doing those, this is the simplified version, they have those four possibilities. The first one that they explain in this video seems very easy. So I'm buying computers, laptop, I'm buying laptop. I have to pay laptop in US dollars. I'm in Russia. I exchange the very same day that I bought it. I'm going to buy on the spot market exactly the equivalent of those dollars that I need to do the payments. And then I'm going to do the payments maybe like 30 days from now when it's due. What's good about this one and what is bad about this approach? I definitely don't have an exchange risk anymore. I exactly know how much I'm going to pay for it. So that's not going to change. But that would be kind of positive thing. But what is negative here?
You may choose not the best time to exchange your currencies because, for example, maybe next day you may spend less rubles to buy the same amount of dollars.
That's the first option. Second one? No? What else is not right here? Again, as you know, in life, we can't get it all. You know, there is always a trade-off. I've been talking about economics. There are always trade-offs. So our trade-off for this particular one will be, I don't like to have to hold, to keep this exchange rate risk, not knowing what's going to happen in 30 days. So I'm going to go buying all upfront. What Nikita said is, okay, yeah, tomorrow the exchange rate be more preferable, but tomorrow it can be also less preferable. So I may be losing more money. The negative thing here is you are using your funds today. You don't need to pay for next 30 days. What we said in first class in economics, I have always limited resources. So now I'm using my limited resources. I'm buying from my limited resources these dollars, so I want to avoid exchange rate risk. But guess what? I may be actually better off by putting my resources, limited resources, in producing something else that can bring me more money. However, my core concern here is I want to reduce my exchange rate risk, and I have done it by doing this. Now, the next one was a forward contract. A forward contract is also good. Why? Because I can exactly lock in the price today that I have to pay in 30 days for my, let's say, obligations that were importing those laptops. And I go to the bank, and what is good about this is they're really going to give me the contract, because forward contract is literally a contract between you and the bank on exact amount of money that you will have to have your payables 30 days from now. So again, the whole point with both of those is I want to reduce my risk. I want today to know how much money, how much my rubles I'm actually going to pay. How much is this laptop really going to cost me in rubles? And companies don't like uncertainty. Period. You want to know exactly now how much money I have, how much is, going to cost me to pay the workers, how much is going to cost me to pay for electricity, how much is going to cost me to pay for XYZ. So that's why companies like certainty, and that's why will they engage in this particular contract. The third one, I think it was an option. And an option is a little bit more interesting here. Why? Because I'm locking in the exchange rate today. So I'm exactly buying today how much that exchange rate is going to be 30 days from now. So I know I don't have an uncertainty. What is good about that is I have an option. What if on that 30 days from now, when I have to do my payables, what if exchange rate on the spot market on that day is more favorable than the one that I lock in self in? This is why option is good. I have an option to leave my option to expire. I don't need to use it. I don't need to buy it at that exchange rate. I'm going on spot market and I'm going to buy it on that spot market. Of course, for that kind of service, as you know, nothing is free of charge. You have to pay a fee. Now, the last one, what they have suggested. Who is going to explain to me the last scenario that they gave us, what we can do? So what was the last one? What was the last one about?
If I understand what you're asking, you mean like the changing of currency? Yeah, the swap. So I should explain how it works. So basically, they were changing an unequal amount. Companies, yeah, I guess partners from different countries. Okay, well, Brazilian and British, for example. Yeah. So they Brazilian borrowing in pounds and British will borrow in pesos. You mean like the swap? Well, I'm starting to regret this.
Well, Brazilian will get their money in Britain, like they will get to British bank some amount of their reals, and get from the bank certain amount of British pounds, and the same situation with the British businessmen in Brazil. Like, but it's why they should go somewhere, like they could do it in their own bank.
So basically, if that's the scenario, they wouldn't be swapping anything. So this is how they're going to avoid all of that exchange rate. So this is what that last scenario was about. They have obligations in each other currencies. So the British obligation is in Brazilian currency, the Brazilian obligation is in British currency. In order for them to avoid exchange rate risk, each of them is going to go to their own bank in their own country and borrow the money that the other party needs. And let's suppose that there are those equivalent amount of money. The other one is going to go to their local bank and borrow the money in their local currency. So we don't have any exchange rate risk here because they have obligations over their local bank in their local currency. So far, so good. And then they're going to swap. What's bad here? What is the risk here? So again, there is no exchange risk, but what is the other risk that they're faced with here? So each of them have obligations in their local currency in their local banks. Then they're going to swap the money that they just borrowed, and each of them is going to do the payments in this one and that one. But what can go wrong? Okay, well, that's obvious, but that's number one. I mean, it's very difficult to find equivalent amount of obligation for one party and the other party and to match. So that's very difficult to find to begin with. So it will be unlikely that they will actually have that to find that partner, and that can actually then question the whole process. Again, those are some 4 options that you can use, 4 possibilities that you can use in order to reduce exchange rate exposure. This is what we in general use the term hedging. So the companies can hedge against all three of those, transaction, translation, and economic. Very often you will find in literature that they are dismissing importance of translation exposure and hedging of the translation exposure, because they are saying, why should we hedge something that is really just the consequence of translating from one currency our earnings to another currency. And it does make sense. However, as you know, we are all humans. And as you know, we most of the time like to keep our jobs. And what does that mean? That means that actually if you are a chief accounting officer of that particular company that will be exposed to this translation exposure, you will actually like to hedge, because you will like to know that at the end of the day, your operations of your subsidiary are not going to be penalized because of the exchange rate risk. You want to show that you are actually making money, and therefore you may even hedge against translation exposure. The tricky part with the translation exposure is you really don't know the amount that you have to hedge. If you remember, with transaction is this laptop costs $1,000. I exactly know how much I have to hedge. But with translation, you will actually have to buy a contract much in advance without knowing what your final numbers at the end of that year are going to be. So you may actually calculate, you may buy more than you need, or you may buy less, and that can show as actually that can be reported depending on the exchange rate. That can be reported as a loss that will not be tax deductible. So it's a very, very tricky thing. Now, to summarize all of this, we are obviously multinational corporations that are operating around the world. They're operating in more than one country. That's why they're multinationals after all. So they will be exposed to the exchange rate risk. They will have to think about hedging or dealing with those exchange rate risks, but definitely first they have to actually recognize what are they. We have transaction exposure risk that is related directly to the transaction, to the sales or buying receivables of payables of the export or import products. And we have to recognize that. And as I said, exchange rates are much more volatile than anything else can be. For example, interest rates can move a little bit a day. Exchange rate can move like 50% down, 70% down. So everything that you earn and you are thinking you are doing the right thing is going to actually disappear because of exchange rate volatility and movement. We have economic exposure, and again, that is operational exposure that we have to take into consideration, and we also have translation exposure. And now, having said all of this, I want to show to you one not relatively, for you it's actually absolutely very old video from the late 70s by very important scientist, and you will find his name, very, very famous economist. And you may find some very interesting sentences that he will be talking about. And you might be asking yourself, is it 1978, 1979, or is it 2019? So let's see what he has to say.
The language is almost always about how we must export. And what's really good is an industry that produces export. And if we buy from abroad and import, that's bad. But surely that's just upside down as well. What we send abroad, we can't eat, we can't wear, we can't use for our houses. The goods and services we send abroad are goods and services not available to us. On the other hand, the goods and services we import, they provide us with TV sets we can watch, with automobiles we can drive, with all sorts of nice things for us to use. The gain from foreign trade is what we import. What we export is the cost of getting those imports. And the proper objective for a nation, as Adam Smith put it, is to arrange things so we get as large a volume of imports as possible for as small a volume of exports as possible. When people talk about a favorable balance of trade, what is that term taken to mean? It's taken to mean that we export more than we import. But from the point of view of our well-being, that's an unfavorable balance. That means we're sending out more goods and getting fewer in. Each of you in your private household would know better than that. You don't regard it as a favorable balance when you have to send out more goods to get less coming in. It's favorable when you can get more by sending out less. This tendency to concentrate on the productive side of our lives and to neglect the side of consumption is reinforced by the fact that even for the productive side of our lives, the visible effects of tariffs are good, the invisible effects of tariffs are bad, even on the productive side. It's perfectly clear that if you restrict the imports of steel, there are some workers in the steel industry who will have jobs they otherwise would not have. The beneficial effects for them of a tariff is perfectly clear. But if we import less steel, foreigners earn fewer dollars. They have fewer dollars to spend in this country. There are people around the country who will not have jobs, not have productive jobs. But that's invisible. The people who might have been producing goods to sell abroad don't know they might have had that job. So, out of sight, out of mind. And as a result, on both the side of consumption and the side of producers, you have the concentrated special interest versus the diffuse general interest. But then you will say to me, what's wrong with all these fine arguments I hear? What's wrong with the arguments by George Meany at the AFL-CIO convention that the high-wage American workers are being unfairly competed against by the low-wage foreign workers? That we have to protect our American workers and their standard of living from the competition of foreigners in Japan or Korea or somewhere else who are willing to work for much less than the American worker. What's wrong with that argument? Well, in the first place, what does a high wage and a low wage mean? The Japanese worker is paid in yen. The American worker is paid in dollars. How do I know how many dollars equals how many yen? Let me go at this a little more indirectly. You can see the fallacy in this argument, I think, most clearly by taking a very, very extreme case. Let's take the most extreme case of all. Let's suppose that at the existing exchange rate, whatever it is, Japan, to take the example which is a favorite whipping boy, Japan could undersell us in everything. That a Japanese can produce whatever you name across the board, from wheat and soybeans to television sets and automobiles, more cheaply than we can. And let's see what would happen. We'd rush to buy them. The Japanese sellers would be paid for them in dollars. What would they do with the dollars? Nothing for them to buy in the United States, because by assumption, everything's cheaper in Japan. What then would they do with the dollars? If they would be willing to burn them up, oh, that'd be wonderful. After all, there is no product we can produce more cheaply than green pieces of paper. But of course, the Japanese are not going to do that. They aren't going to work and produce goods and send them over here in order to get pieces of paper which they're going to burn up. They want to get goods and services. And when they discover that there are no American goods and services that are cheaper than those in Japan, they will say, well, gee, I better convert these dollars back into yen. But who's going to sell them yen? Why would anybody sell them yen? Because if I have yen, I can buy the Japanese goods by assumption more cheaply. So nobody would be willing to sell yen. Well, let's suppose to begin with, the price, the rate of exchange between the dollar and the yen was, as it was for a long time, 360 yen to the dollar, or $1 would buy 360 yen. Well, then these people who had all these dollars that were useless to them would say, gee, if you'll sell me some yen, I'll give you $1 for 300 yen. No, says the owner of the yen. Even at 300 yen to the dollar, American goods are too expensive. They're not worth it. Okay, I'll give you $1 for 200 yen. And you can see what would happen. The price of the yen would be bid up until what? Well, the fewer yen you get for $1, the more expensive Japanese goods are to Americans. The more dollars you get for a yen, the cheaper American goods are to Japanese. And so the effect of this would have to be that the yen would rise in price until it was no longer true that all U.S. goods were more expensive than all Japanese goods. Because as the yen became more expensive, Japanese goods would become more expensive to U.S. citizens in dollars, and American goods would become cheaper to Japanese in yen. And that would continue until roughly, on the average, the amount of goods, the dollar value of the goods that the Japanese would buy in the United States would be roughly equal to the dollar value of the goods that the U.S. would sell. And at that point, the price of the yen in terms of the dollar would be at an appropriate level. Now, I've simplified the story because over and above these bilateral transactions between the United States and Japan, of course, these flows of trade will take roundabout directions. The Japanese will spend some of their dollars in Brazil, and the Brazilians, in turn, will spend their dollars in the U.S., and the dollars may flow in very roundabout circles. But the principle is the same. People want dollars, not in order to have pieces of paper, but in order to have U.S. or other goods. And again, the actual situation is complicated by the fact that in addition to the flows of goods and services, there are also capital flows, also investments abroad. The United States, throughout the 19th century, throughout the period when we were building up and getting to be the economically most developed country in the world, the United States had a balance of payments deficit, trade deficit every single year, almost. Why? Because the U.S. was a country in which foreigners wanted to invest capital. The British were producing goods and sending them over to us in return for pieces of paper. Not those green pieces of paper, but different pieces of paper, bonds, promising to pay back a sum of money at a later time plus interest on it. And the British regarded that as a good investment, and they regarded it, therefore, as worth their while to send us goods in order to get those pieces of paper. And there was nothing wrong with that. On the contrary, we benefited by having foreign investment here that enabled us to develop more rapidly. And the British benefited by getting a higher yield on their savings than they could have gotten any other way. In the 20th century, that was reversed. We had what this was called a favorable balance of trade because the U.S. citizens were finding that they could get a higher return for their money by investing abroad than they could at home. And as a result, we were sending goods abroad in return for those pieces of paper. Again, in the post-World War II world, under American foreign aid and Marshall Plan programs, we were making gifts abroad. We were sending goods and services abroad as an expression of our belief that that was a contribution to a peaceful world. So the situation is more complicated. But the fundamental point is the same. So long as you have a free exchange rate, which is free to determine in the market the price of the dollar in terms of the yen, there is no balance of payments problem. There is no sense in which American industry is in danger of being undercut by foreign industries and destroyed. Let me put the matter to you a little differently. Suppose on the average, an American worker is roughly twice as productive as the average Japanese worker. That's roughly what the situation is. On the average, the American worker takes home from his work, as pay for his activities, a sum of money which will buy about twice as large a basket of goods as his Japanese counterpart can buy. If that's the case, we cannot afford, well, that's a little exaggeration. We should not use any American worker in an activity in which he's less than twice as efficient. This is what was dubbed 150 years ago in the jargon of economics the principle of comparative advantage. We may be more efficient in everything than the Japanese. That doesn't mean it pays us to produce everything at home. We should concentrate on our efforts on those activities in which we are the most efficient. Let me put it to you in a simple way. In a domestic illustration, I have a lawyer who's a very good typist. Does that mean he should dispense with his secretary and type his own letters? He may be a better typist than his secretary. But if he's only 1.5 times as good a typist, but 5 times as good a lawyer, both he and his secretary are better off if he concentrates on doing the law and she concentrates on typing the letters. Or, in this day and age, I should say, she concentrates on doing the law and he concentrates on typing the letters.
Okay, the reason why I wanted to show you this video, there are actually a few reasons. One is because it's like 30, 40, who knows how many years old. And it's for 40, is it 40 already or 50? And it's like almost like we are hearing it today. Because the topics that he was talking about are really, really very, very current. And the debates that we had at that time and the debates that we have today are very, very similar. So that was the one reason that I wanted to show you. But also another one is just that you can really see, again, one more time for tonight, the importance of exchange rates and how they can change the raison d'etre of your existence in the business. And the third reason was because in this relatively short video, he was able to wrap up a lot of concepts that we have been talking in last few weeks. So I was thinking maybe this would be a good way to refresh our memories about some topics like comparative and absolute advantages and balance of trade, and also the importance of international institutions and the whole thing that was happening after the Second World War, who was having trade deficit and who was having trade surpluses. So I think this will be a nice ending for tonight. Thank you all for coming, and then see you on Thursday.